the history of lesbian lifestyles is complex, shaped by cultural, social, and political factors over centuries. While the term lesbian itself originates from the island of Lesbos in ancient Greece, where the poet Sappho lived and wrote poetry about love between women, lesbian relationships and identities have existed in various forms throughout history. Here's a brief overview. Ancient history. Ancient Greece and Rome. Sappho, who lived on the island of Lesbos around 600 BCE, is one of the earliest known figures associated with female same-sex love. Although details of her relationships are debated, her poetry reflects intense emotional and possibly sexual bonds between women. However, in general, female same-sex relationships were not openly celebrated in these ancient cultures, the way male homosexuality sometimes was. Middle Ages and early modern era medieval Europe. The Middle Ages were marked by strong religious influence, and same-sex acts, including between women, were condemned by the Catholic Church. Women who had romantic relationships with each other were often forced to remain secretive, though historical records show that such relationships existed. There are court records of women being tried for female sodomy, suggesting that authorities were aware of and punished female same-sex relationships. Renaissance and early modern period. In this period, lesbian relationships were often hidden or coded in literature and art. Women's roles were largely domestic, and marriages were arranged primarily for economic or political reasons, leaving little room for the open expression of same-sex attraction. However, there are instances of romantic friendships between women, which may or may not have been sexual, but were deeply emotional and intimate. 19th century romantic friendships. In the 19th century, intense same-sex relationships between women were sometimes referred to as romantic friendships. These relationships were often accepted, especially among unmarried women, as long as they did not challenge traditional gender roles or marriage structures. Writers like Emily Dickinson and authors like Sarah Orne Jewett are thought to have had these kinds of relationships. Emerging lesbian identity. Toward the end of the century, with the rise of sexology as a field of study, the concept of homosexuality as an identity began to develop. Figures like Karl Heinrich Ulrichs and Magnus Hirschfeld in Europe began to advocate for the recognition and decriminalization of same-sex relationships. This period also saw the rise of lesbian subcultures, particularly in urban areas. Early 20th century 1920s, 1930s. In cities like Paris and Berlin, there were thriving lesbian subcultures, especially in the 1920s. Figures like Gertrude Stein, Natalie Clifford Barney, and Radcliffe Hall, whose 1928 novel, The Well of Loneliness, is one of the first books to explicitly explore lesbianism, became well known within these circles. Hall's book was banned in the UK for its open depiction of a lesbian relationship, showing the societal constraints lesbians still faced. Lesbian visibility in the arts. The Harlem Renaissance in the U.S. saw prominent Black lesbian and bisexual women like blues singer Ma Rainey and writer Angelina Weld Grimke express their experiences through art and music. This period helped expand the visibility of lesbian life, even though it was still often concealed within certain cultural boundaries. Post-W2 era, 1940s, 1960s. After World War II, many women who had worked in traditionally male roles returned to domestic life, but the post-war period also saw the formation of lesbian social groups, particularly in cities. In the U.S., this era was marked by fear and repression, with lesbians and gay men targeted in the government's anti-communist witch hunts, known as the Lavender Scare, lesbian bars, and butch femme culture. In the 1950s and 60s, lesbian bars and nightclubs became more prominent. Lesbian communities developed distinct subcultures, including butch femme dynamics, which involved clear gender roles within relationships. This period also saw the rise of lesbian pulp fiction, which often depicted tragic or unhappy endings, but also gave lesbians a way to see themselves represented. Lesbian feminism and the gay liberation movement, 1970s, second wave feminism. During the 1970s, the feminist movement expanded to include lesbian voices, with figures like Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich advocating for the recognition of lesbian identity within feminism. The term lesbian feminist came into use, and many women rejected traditional gender roles within relationships. Stonewall riots and aftermath. The 1969 Stonewall riots in New York City are often credited with sparking the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement. Though the movement initially focused more on gay men, lesbians played a significant role in the activism of the time, including forming groups like the Daughters of Bilitis, one of the first lesbian organizations in the U.S. 1980s present AIDS crisis and activism. In the 1980s, the LGBTQ+ community was heavily affected by the AIDS crisis, and many lesbians became involved in activism and caregiving for gay men who were affected by the disease. This era also saw increased visibility for lesbians, with more films, literature, and public figures coming out as lesbian, marriage equality, and modern rights. In recent decades, legal battles for marriage equality and anti-discrimination laws have helped shift societal attitudes toward lesbians. Prominent lesbians in public life, including Ellen DeGeneres, Rachel Maddow, and many others, have helped bring lesbian visibility into the mainstream. Today, there are more spaces for lesbians to express their identities openly, though challenges around intersectionality, race, and gender expression remain central to the community's ongoing struggle. Throughout history, the lesbian experience has been shaped by societal repression, periods of visibility and acceptance, and continued efforts for rights and recognition. The lesbian lifestyle has evolved, becoming more varied and complex as ideas about gender, sexuality, and relationships have expanded.